Bitter winds howled like starved wolves against the glass. Frost crept rapidly across the window panes, sealing the town of Oakhaven in a freezing tomb of white. While families shivered in their dark, powerless living rooms, regretting every cruel joke they ever made, one woman sat drinking hot tea, perfectly warm. Margaret Sullivan was not a woman prone to panic, nor was she a doomsday prepper, wearing tin foil and hoarding ammunition. She was a 58-year-old retired structural geologist who had spent 3 decades studying the Earth's violent history. When she purchased the sprawling, 5-acre plot on the exposed western ridge of Oakhaven, Montana, she did so for the breathtaking views of the Bitterroot Mountains. But Margaret also knew what those mountains were capable of. She had read the local historical archives. She knew about the catastrophic blizzard of 1910, a meteorological anomaly that had buried the valley under 15 feet of snow in 3 days, freezing livestock solid where they stood and claiming the lives of 40 unprepared settlers. The town of Oakhaven had forgotten. Nestled in a picturesque valley, the modern residents relied on their heavily insulated, timber-framed homes, their propane generators, and the swift plows of the County Road Commission. They lived in an era of convenience, entirely detached from the raw, unbridled fury of nature. Margaret's project began in early April. The ground had barely thawed when the heavy machinery arrived. Instead of landscaping her beautiful property or building a wraparound porch like a normal retiree, she hired an excavator to tear a massive, gaping wound into the side of the limestone hill behind her house. The gossip started at the Bluebird Diner, a local hub where the coffee was bitter and the opinions were freely shared. Bill Henderson, a retired high school football coach who lived a quarter-mile down the ridge from Margaret, was the first to sound the alarm of neighborhood weirdness. "I drove past the Sullivan place this morning," Bill announced, leaning over a plate of greasy eggs. "She's got a backhoe digging a crater. Asked her if she was putting in a pool. You know what she said. She said she's building a root cellar." Bill chuckled, shaking his head. "A root cellar the size of a 2-car garage, with rebar." The diner erupted in mild amusement, but the amusement quickly morphed into irritation and outright mockery as the weeks progressed. Margaret was not merely digging a hole, she was constructing a fortress. Every morning at dawn, the delivery trucks rumbled up the mountain road, carrying pallets of heavy quarried fieldstone, industrial-grade steel rebar, and bags of high-yield concrete. Margaret, a small but fiercely determined woman with silver hair usually tied back in a dusty bandana, worked alongside a pair of baffled local stonemasons. They poured a foundation 3 feet thick. They erected walls of solid stone, reinforced with a grid of steel that could withstand a localized earthquake. When Margaret went down to Mitchell's Hardware and Supply for more supplies, she faced the brunt of the town's condescension. Tom Mitchell, the store's owner, was a man who prided himself on knowing everyone's business. He leaned heavily on his counter, smirking as Margaret handed him a list that included heavy-duty ventilation pipes, a steel core security door, and extreme low-temperature caulking. "You expecting a nuclear fallout, Maggie?" Tom asked, his voice loud enough for the other customers in the aisles to hear. Margaret didn't flinch. She met his mocking gaze with calm, steel-grey eyes. "I'm expecting a severe winter, Tom. The jet stream patterns are showing anomalies I haven't seen in 30 years. I prefer to be prepared." Tom scoffed, ringing up the heavy bolts. "We got snowplows, Maggie. We got the power grid. This ain't the pioneer days. You're throwing away your retirement money on a stone tomb." "I appreciate your concern," Margaret replied evenly, paying in cash and hauling the heavy canvas bags out to her truck herself. The whispers grew louder. Crazy Maggie, the Ridge Hermit. Susan Henderson, Bill's wife, and the undisputed queen of the local homeowners association, went so far as to file a formal complaint with the county zoning board, claiming Margaret's monstrosity was an eyesore that would plummet their property values. The county inspector came out, walked the site, reviewed the meticulously drawn architectural blueprints, and begrudgingly admitted that everything was perfectly up to code. In fact, he noted, it was the most structurally sound building in a 50-mile radius. By August, the structure was complete. It was an engineering marvel, albeit a strange one. Built directly into the earth to utilize geothermal insulation, the shelter's exposed front was crafted from beautiful, rugged river stone. The roof was slightly sloped, reinforced with concrete and steel, and covered entirely with 2 feet of earth and native grasses, rendering it almost invisible from above. Inside, it was a cozy, hyper-efficient sanctuary. It featured a small wood-burning cast-iron stove with a double-walled chimney, a hand pump well drilled deep into the aquifer, floor-to-ceiling shelves stocked with dried goods and canned preserves, and a massive stack of seasoned oak firewood. The door was heavy iron, lined with industrial weather stripping. It wasn't a tomb. It was a lifeboat. But to the Hendersons, to Tom Mitchell, and to the rest of Oakhaven, it was the punchline of every joke. When they saw Margaret tending to her native grass roof or stacking wood, they pointed and laughed from the comfort of their air-conditioned SUVs. They felt secure in their fragile timber castles, entirely unaware that the sky above the Pacific was already beginning to churn. Autumn bled into winter with a deceptive gentleness. November brought crisp, clear days, and only a dusting of light, powdery snow that melted by the afternoon. Thanksgiving came and went without a hitch. The town of Oakhaven was draped in festive holiday lights, and the mockery of Margaret Sullivan reached a fever pitch. "Hey, Maggie," Bill Henderson hollered from the edge of his property one unseasonably warm December afternoon. Margaret was out inspecting the seal on her shelter's heavy iron door. "You want to borrow my lawnmower for your roof? I think your bunker's getting overgrown. Sure is a brutal winter we're having." Margaret wiped a smudge of grease from her cheek and looked at Bill. She didn't smile, but she didn't scowl either. She simply looked at him with a profound, quiet pity. "Check your barometer, Bill," she called back over the distance, "and make sure you have enough propane." Bill just laughed, waving her off before retreating into his expansive, poorly insulated, cathedral-ceilinged home. By mid-December, the local meteorologists were forecasting a standard winter storm. Nothing to worry about, the smiling news anchors assured the public. Just a few inches of snow, maybe a bit of wind. The municipal plows were gassed up and ready. The grocery stores saw a mild uptick in bread and milk sales, but there was no panic. Margaret, however, was not watching the local news. She was monitoring raw satellite data and atmospheric pressure charts on her ham radio setup. What she saw made her blood run cold. A massive, historically unprecedented polar vortex was breaking off from the Arctic, plunging southward at a terrifying speed. Simultaneously, a hypersaturated atmospheric river of moisture was sweeping in from the Pacific. The two systems were on a direct collision course, and ground zero was the Bitterroot Valley. It wouldn't be a storm, it would be a siege. The shift happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The unseasonable warmth vanished in an instant, replaced by a biting, metallic chill that tasted like iron in the back of the throat. The sky didn't turn grey, it turned a bruised, sickly purple. The wind died completely. For 3 hours the town of Oakhaven sat in an eerie, suffocating silence. Even the birds vanished. Then the first flake fell. It wasn't a gentle, drifting snowflake. It was a hard, pellet-like shard of ice. Within 20 minutes, the sky opened up, unleashing a blinding wall of white. The wind returned, not as a breeze, but as a shrieking banshee, instantly clocking in at 60 miles per hour. Down in the valley, people watched from their windows with mild amusement, snapping photos for social media. But by nightfall, the amusement evaporated. The snow was falling at an astonishing rate of 5 inches an hour. The wind violently whipped the snow into massive drifts, burying cars, blocking doors, and snapping ancient pine trees like brittle toothpicks. At 8:15 p.m., the real crisis began. The heavy, wet snow and hurricane-force winds proved too much for the valley's aging infrastructure. A massive transmission tower at the edge of town buckled and collapsed in a shower of blue sparks. In an instant, the entire town of Oakhaven plunged into absolute darkness. Inside the Henderson residence, the cathedral ceilings suddenly felt less like a luxury and more like a curse. All the residual heat instantly began rising, leaving the living space freezing. Bill confidently went to the garage to fire up his expensive backup propane generator. It hummed to life, providing a false sense of security. But what Bill hadn't accounted for was the wind. The intake vents on the side of his house were rapidly buried under a 6-foot snowdrift, choking the generator's exhaust system. Carbon monoxide alarms began blaring wildly, forcing Bill to shut the machine down. They were trapped in the dark, with the temperature inside the house plummeting toward freezing. Down at the hardware store, Tom Mitchell was trapped. He had stayed late doing inventory and was now completely snowed in. The large, single-pane display windows of his shop rattled violently against the gale. He huddled in his office, wearing 3 coats, realizing with mounting horror that his inventory of flashlights and batteries meant nothing if he couldn't generate heat. The power lines were dead. The roads were utterly impassable. No plows were coming. Up on the ridge, the brunt of the storm hit with maximum ferocity. The wind screamed across the exposed rock, tearing shingles off Margaret's main house and shattering the large picture windows facing the mountains. The beautiful, modern home she had purchased was rapidly becoming an icy death trap. But Margaret wasn't in the main house. Hours before the first flake fell, she had calmly packed her favorite books, her knitting, her emergency medical kit, and her cat, Barnaby, and walked the 50 yards to the stone shelter. As the storm raged outside, burying the ridge under feet of crushing snow, Margaret engaged the heavy steel deadbolts of her iron door. The shrieking wind was immediately muffled, reduced to a distant, dull roar. The earth surrounding the shelter provided incredible natural insulation, keeping the ambient temperature in the 50s. She lit a match and touched it to the kindling in the cast-iron stove. Within minutes, a cheerful fire was crackling, radiating an immense, comforting heat that soaked into the solid stone walls and reflected back into the room. She lit a kerosene lamp, casting a warm, golden glow over her fully stocked shelves. Margaret put a kettle on the stove, sat down in her rocking chair, and listened to the muffled fury of the apocalypse happening just outside her reinforced walls. She was safe. But as she took a sip of her tea, a heavy sadness settled over her. She knew her neighbors, the very people who had spent the last 8 months laughing at her, were currently fighting for their lives in the freezing dark. And the storm was only just beginning. By the dawn of the second day, the town of Oakhaven had ceased to function. The snow had not stopped. It had intensified, driven horizontally by sustained winds of 70 miles per hour. The temperature plummeted to a bone-chilling 25 degrees below zero, with wind chills making it feel like -50. The picturesque valley was unrecognizable, buried beneath towering, sculpted drifts of white that swallowed cars whole and reached the second-story windows of many homes. Inside the Henderson residence, the situation had shifted from uncomfortable to critically dangerous. Bill and Susan Henderson were huddled beneath every blanket they owned in the center of their sprawling living room. The cathedral ceilings, once a major selling point of the property, were now a vast reservoir of freezing air pressing down upon them. Frost had formed thick, crystalline webs on the inside of their expensive double-paned windows. Every breath they took materialized as a thick plume of white vapor. Bill's hands shook uncontrollably as he tried to ignite the gas fireplace, but without electricity to power the ignition and the blower, it was useless. They had attempted to burn a decorative wooden chair in the small, decorative hearth, but the chimney was blocked by snow, and toxic wood smoke had rapidly filled the room, forcing them to extinguish the meager flames with precious bottled water. "Bill, I can't feel my toes," Susan whimpered, her voice muffled beneath a thick wool scarf. Her usually perfectly styled hair was matted against her head, and her face was pale, her lips tinged with a terrifying shade of blue. "We're going to freeze to death in here." Bill held his wife tight, his own teeth chattering so violently it hurt his jaw. He felt a sickening wave of guilt and utter helplessness wash over him. He had spent his life being a man of action, a loud, confident coach who directed others. Now, nature had stripped him of all authority. He was just a fragile organism, trapped in a freezing, poorly designed box. A mile away, in a more modest ranch home, Arthur and Joanne Jenkins were facing a similar nightmare. Arthur, a retired accountant who had joined in the diner's chorus of laughter regarding Margaret's shelter, was desperately trying to keep his diabetic wife warm. The cold was sapping her energy, and her blood sugar levels were becoming dangerously erratic due to the stress on her body. Arthur had tried to trudge out to the main road to find help, but he hadn't made it past his own driveway before the whiteout conditions completely disoriented him. The snow was chest-high, heavy, and wet beneath the frozen crust. He had barely managed to crawl back to his front door, his face stinging with the first signs of frostnip. As the afternoon light faded into a murky, terrifying grey on day 3, the bitter reality settled over the scattered residents of the ridge. No ploughs were coming. No rescue helicopters could fly in this visibility. The power grid was catastrophic ruins. They were entirely, utterly alone. It was in this desperate silence that a thought pierced through Bill Henderson's panic-fogged mind. An image of solid, quarried fieldstone, a heavy iron door, 2 feet of earth insulation, crazy Maggie. Bill sat up straight, pushing the heavy blankets aside. The ambient air hit him like a physical blow, but his mind was racing. "Susan!" he croaked, his throat raw from the dry, freezing air. "Susan, listen to me. We have to leave the house." Susan looked at him through heavy, half-lidded eyes. "Leave? Bill, we'll die out there in 5 minutes. We'll die in here in 5 hours, Bill countered, his voice rising with desperate conviction. "Margaret Sullivan, her bunker. It's built into the earth. It has a wood stove. I saw the cordwood myself." Susan hesitated, a flicker of profound shame piercing through her physical misery. "Bill, we reported her to the county. We laughed at her in front of the whole town. She hates us." "I don't care if she spits in my face. I'm not letting you freeze to death," Bill declared, forcing himself to his feet. His legs felt like lead. He gathered every layer of clothing they possessed: ski pants, wool sweaters, down parkas, multiple pairs of socks. He wrapped Susan's boots in plastic grocery bags before shoving them into her snow boots to block the moisture. He found an old, heavy-duty orange extension cord in the garage and securely tied one end around his waist and the other around Susan's. In a whiteout, letting go of a hand meant losing someone forever. "We follow the property line fence," Bill instructed, shouting over the roar of the wind rattling the walls. "It leads straight up the ridge to her plot. We don't stop. We don't let go." Opening their front door took all of Bill's remaining strength, as a 3-foot drift had settled against it. When the door finally gave way, the storm surged into the foyer like an angry, living beast, covering the hardwood floors in a blanket of white. Stepping out into the maelstrom was like stepping onto an alien planet. The wind deafened them instantly, a continuous, mechanical shriek that vibrated in their chest cavities. The air was a chaotic swirl of ice shards that scoured exposed skin like sandpaper. Bill leaned forward, putting his head down, and began to plow through the waist-deep drifts, pulling Susan behind him. The quarter-mile journey, a distance Bill usually jogged in a few minutes, became a brutal, agonizing odyssey. Every step required a monumental effort of will. They sank into the powder, their muscles burning, their lungs searing with the Arctic air. They fell repeatedly, the snow instantly packing into their collars and sleeves. Twice, Susan simply stopped moving, her body wanting to surrender to the cold, sleepy embrace of hypothermia. Bill had to forcefully yank the orange cord, screaming her name into the wind until she forced herself back upright. After 45 minutes of pure torture, Bill's gloved hand bumped into something hard beneath the snow. He scraped away the ice and found the top rail of Margaret's split-rail property fence. They had made it to her land. But as they crested the final rise toward where Margaret's main house stood, a new horror awaited them. The beautiful, modern, timber-framed house that Margaret had purchased upon moving to Oak Haven was destroyed. The hurricane-force winds, screaming off the Bitterroot Mountains, had caught the overhanging eaves of the roof and peeled it back like the lid of a tin can. The large picture windows were completely blown out. The interior of the home was packed with snow, the furniture destroyed, the structure groaning ominously as if ready to collapse entirely. Susan dropped to her knees in the snow, a muffled sob escaping her frozen lips. "She's dead," Susan cried, the sound snatched away by the wind. "Bill, the house is gone. We're dead too." Bill stood, paralyzed, staring at the ruined shell of the house. Despair, heavy and suffocating, finally broke his spirit. The town had mocked her for building a bunker, but they hadn't realized her actual house was just as vulnerable as theirs. But then, Bill remembered the layout of the property. He remembered the earth-moving machines back in April. He remembered the jokes at the diner. The root cellar wasn't in the house, it was behind it. He violently tugged the cord, pulling Susan to her feet. "No, behind the house! The hill!" They skirted the dangerous wreckage of the main house, battling through a massive snowdrift that had accumulated against the ruined walls. As they rounded the corner, facing the sheer limestone side of the hill, they saw it. Because of the aerodynamic slope of the earth-covered roof, the wind had swept the snow clear over the top of the shelter, leaving the rugged riverstone facade relatively exposed. More importantly, the heavy iron door was not buried. A small, persistent curl of dark wood smoke was whipping out from the reinforced chimney pipe protruding from the hillside, instantly whisked away by the gale. It was a beacon of life in a dead world. Bill practically dragged Susan the last 30 yards. They collapsed against the heavy iron door. Bill pounded on it with his frozen, clumsy fists. "Margaret! Margaret, please! It's Bill! Help us!" The wind was so loud he couldn't even hear his own voice. He pounded until his knuckles bled through his gloves, leaving dark smears on the frosted iron. Inside the shelter, Margaret was sitting in her rocking chair, a sleeping Barnaby purring loudly in her lap. The thick stone walls and earth insulation reduced the apocalyptic storm outside to a manageable, continuous rumble. She was reading a weathered paperback by the warm, golden light of a kerosene lamp. The cast-iron stove radiated a magnificent, steady heat, keeping the room at a comfortable 68 degrees. Suddenly she paused. Over the low roar of the wind, she heard a distinct, rhythmic thudding against the steel core door. She carefully set her book down, moved Barnaby to a cushion, and stood up. She walked to the heavy door and peered through the thick, reinforced peephole. Distorted by the curved glass and the swirling snow, she could just make out 2 figures huddled against her threshold, draped in orange cord, looking like colourful corpses in the snow. Margaret didn't hesitate. She didn't pause to gloat, nor did she feel a surge of vindictive triumph. She only felt a profound sense of human duty. She unlatched the heavy deadbolts, 3 of them, locking deep into the stone frame, and grabbed the heavy handle, bracing her boots against the floor. As she pulled the door inward, the wind violently caught it, throwing it open and blasting a cloud of freezing white powder into the warm room. Bill and Susan tumbled inside, collapsing onto the thick woven rug in a heap of snow, ice, and desperate tears. Margaret grabbed the heavy iron handle, planted her feet, and hauled the door shut against the immense pressure of the wind, engaging the heavy bolts with a loud, definitive clang. The contrast was staggering. The shrieking of the wind was instantly severed, replaced by the gentle crackle of the wood stove. The killing cold was banished, replaced by a wall of radiant, life-saving heat. The air smelled of wood smoke, old paper, and a rich, savoury beef stew that was simmering on the flat top of the cast-iron stove. Susan lay on the floor, weeping hysterically as the ice in her hair began to melt. Bill pushed himself up onto his knees, his face red and raw, his breathing ragged. He looked up at Margaret. She stood there, looking exactly as she had for months, calm, practical, wearing a thick flannel shirt and sturdy canvas pants. Bill opened his mouth to speak. He wanted to apologize for the jokes, for the HOA complaints, for the lawnmower comment, for everything. But the words caught in his throat. He just looked at the warm fire, at the sturdy stone walls, and then back at the woman he had called a lunatic. "Get those wet clothes off immediately," Margaret said, her voice firm but not unkind. "There are dry wool blankets on the bottom shelf to your left. Move closer to the stove, but not directly against it. You need to thaw slowly to prevent tissue damage." For the next 4 hours, Bill and Susan lay wrapped in heavy wool, sipping steaming mugs of broth, their bodies violently shuddering as their core temperatures slowly returned to normal. Margaret quietly went about her business, checking her ham radio, stoking the fire, and pouring more tea. The awkwardness in the small, hyper-efficient room was palpable. Finally, as the colour began to return to Susan's cheeks, Bill sat up. He looked at Margaret, who was calmly knitting a grey scarf. "Margaret," Bill said, his voice trembling slightly. "Our house. The fireplace failed. The generator choked on the snow. It's freezing in there. When we came up here..." "Your main house." "I know," Margaret said softly, not looking up from her needles. "I heard the roof tear off around midnight last night. The structural integrity of modern timber frames under maximum wind shear is highly predictable. That's why I didn't plan on staying in it." Susan wiped a tear from her eye. "We are so sorry. We laughed at you. We were so cruel, and you opened the door anyway." Margaret finally stopped knitting and looked at them. Her grey eyes held no malice, only the quiet wisdom of a woman who understood the earth far better than she understood the petty squabbles of townspeople. "The mountain doesn't care if you're cruel or kind, Susan," Margaret said evenly. "The wind doesn't care about your property values or what jokes you tell at the diner. Nature is entirely indifferent. We only survive it by acknowledging its power and preparing for its worst. Arrogance is a luxury you can only afford when the weather is nice." Over the next 3 days, the stone shelter became a microcosm of survival. Margaret's ham radio crackled with distress calls from the valley. Arthur and Joanne Jenkins were eventually rescued by a neighbour with a heavily modified snowcat, but several others in the outer ridges were not so lucky. The storm battered Oakhaven relentlessly, burying the town under a historic 80 inches of snow. Inside the bunker, the three of them existed in a strange, peaceful purgatory. Bill, stripped of his pride, became intensely helpful, taking over the task of chopping kindling from the indoor woodpile and managing the stove's temperature. Susan helped prepare meals from Margaret's extensive pantry of canned goods. They talked for hours, not about neighborhood gossip, but about Margaret's career in geology, about the history of the Earth, and about the sheer, terrifying fragility of modern life. They learned that Margaret wasn't crazy, she was just paying attention. On the morning of the 6th day, the wind finally died. The low roar that had become the background noise of their existence vanished, replaced by an absolute, crystalline silence. Margaret unbolted the heavy iron door and pushed. It took the combined strength of Bill and Margaret to force the door outward against the snowdrift that had accumulated. When they finally broke through, blinding sunlight flooded the shelter. They stepped out into a world completely transformed. The trees were entombed in ice. The valley was a smooth, unbroken sea of glittering white. The ruins of Margaret's modern house stood as a stark skeleton against the clear blue sky. Down in the valley, the distant, faint thumping of National Guard search and rescue helicopters echoed off the canyon walls. The ordeal was ending. Bill stood in the snow, looking at the solid, immovable stone face of the shelter, and then at his own ruined hands. He turned to Margaret, extending a hand. "You saved our lives, Maggie. I don't know how I can ever repay you, but I can promise you one thing." Margaret shook his hand, a small, genuine smile finally touching the corners of her mouth. "What's that, Bill?" "I'm never making fun of a root cellar ever again," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And as soon as the road's clear, I'm buying a backhoe. Margaret Sullivan's stone shelter stands today, not as an eyesore, but as a monument to foresight and the unforgiving power of nature. The residents of Oakhaven no longer laugh at preparedness, they learn from it. Survival rarely belongs to the loudest critics, but to those who quietly read the wind, respect the earth, and build foundations strong enough to weather the darkest, coldest nights of our lives."